would I be a hench person if I for sure got like really good physio and extended dental? I might. I know this about myself now.
I'm Michael Tamblyn, CEO of Rakuten Kobo. We make e-readers and apps, and we sell ebooks and audiobooks all over the world, and we do it because we love reading and we want to make reading lives better. One of the best parts of the work that we do is that we get to talk with authors about their latest work as well as the books that shaped them as writers and as readers. This is Kobo in Conversation. My guest today is Natalie Zina Walschots. She is a poet, a game writer. She's the author of the novel Hench. The premise is irresistible. Through Anna, its main character, Hench shows what it might be like to work for a supervillain. Not just anonymously shooting back at the heroes, what's it like to work inside the hollowed-out volcano, to paint the side of the death ray? What's the pay like? How do you get hired? How do you get your budget approved? What's the office vibe? And are some bad guys actually good bosses? She covers all of this and more, and it's fantastic. Natalie Zina Walschots, welcome to Kobo.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm extremely amped to be here.
You are one of these great interview subjects where we could take this in 6 different directions, and the real challenge is deciding where to start. We have your erotically charged supervillain poetry, your life as a creator and contributor in gaming, you as a fan, you as a writer and thinker about fandom and books and comics and video games and slasher films, and your latest book. But because we are all about reading and writing lives, and we want the full life, I want to take you back in time to when it all began. Tell me about Natalie the kid. What was she like as a reader and general consumer of media?
So you need to imagine the least cool child that has ever lived on the planet Earth. And I don't mean like in a now in hindsight is cool sort of way, like put that part out of your mind. Extremely awkward and dorky and not really somebody who I would say grade school was not like an easy experience for me. I don't think that's surprising to anybody who's seen any of my work, but it was a very bad time. So I read voraciously and constantly, often for sheer escapism, but also because one of the great things about being an extremely weird and unpopular kid is you develop a very deep and vast internal world and a huge capacity for imaginative play and imagination. Surprising, I think no one as a teenager, I would get extremely into live action role play and played like a lot of Vampire the Masquerade, and I definitely blame those early experiences being profoundly uncool and needing to escape from my current situation into other and alternate realities. And for sure, my relationship with books and my reading habits was a really profound part of that.
And so what were some of the authors of the series that grabbed you, right away?
I remember reading both The Secret of Nim and Zed for Zachariah as a way too early, like as a very, very little kid, and having those be really profoundly informative to me as early spec fic, like early exposure to spec fic for me. I wouldn't have categorized them that way, but they certainly are. I read a lot of high fantasy. Obviously, like Tolkien was extremely important to me, but so was like Dragonlance and like the Shannara series.
Yes,
and like
it was.
if there was like a wizard holding an orb
is there a
on the cover,
is there a glowing ring, a sword, something?
Yeah. There's like a staff, a dragon in the background. Like, yeah. I'm in. I'm 100% in. I definitely was in then. I also consumed a lot of horror. And the thing about being a horror fan, especially as a little kid, is it's really scary. Like it's actually very frightening and distressing, and certainly I like
It
still
disturbs
experience
sleep
intrusive
cycles.
thoughts.
Yeah. Yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah. I definitely would watch a movie and then not sleep for 3 days because a creature from Seven was definitely like doing that horrible rattling breathing under my bed. So those, those experience of being profoundly unsettled, but also fascinated by material had a really deep impact on me. So I think that, I always gravitated toward genre fiction for the, because of the way that it touched me, because in the way it could transport me to a completely different place, but B also, I feel like the joy, the just sheer pleasure of reading, and also the like profound emotional reactions I had to what I was reading, has always been. I've always felt it most intensely when engaging with genre material.
It's funny how much book discovery has changed, and especially book discovery around genre fiction, because I, as one of those kids who was a sci-fi fan, a fantasy fan, I remember going into the bookstore, and so much of it was, well, that cover's got a dragon on it. Like, clearly this book is for me. There's no metadata. There's no, like, if you've read this, you've also read this. It's just like, okay, clearly this person has put the, like, 2 or 3 visual cues on here that I need. There's an embossed spaceship on the front. All right, let's go. You get my $7.99.
Is a skeleton holding a sword? Great.
Good.
Fantastic.
Excellent. Is also with a ring. Okay, that's all we need.
Right, it's clearly glowing. Yep.
Yeah. That's all I require. And so obviously there's a bigger media diet there. So kind of put the reading in the context of comics and video games and music and the other stuff that was swirling around you. Yeah, kind of as you were going through your teen years.
Oh, sure thing. I started playing video games like as a little kid, like I think a lot of us did, and it's something that I never grew out of. I think that the storytelling that you can do in games is fascinating and profound and not like anything else. And again, certainly some deeply gripping emotional experiences, happened to me while playing games, like while playing Chrono Trigger or early Final Fantasy games. Like when you spend hundreds of hours with a character, and then something great or terrible happens to them, that can be really heart-wrenching. I started collecting comics as a young teen, so like, kind of like 12, 13, 14 maybe. Again, it's something that never left me. I was always profoundly interested in visual storytelling and in the sort of cross or transmedia potential in comic books that's always been there. Yeah, and I've always been a fan of aggressive music. So those sorts of things all fit together to, again, I think, at least at the time, make me deeply less cool, but also very much informed the way that my relationship with storytelling developed.
As a comic collector, were you a read it till they fall apart collector or a slipcover collector?
Read it till they fall apart. Yeah, okay. I definitely was there to read them. I collect. I still collect, and at the time collected the graphic novel forms much more than I did individual comics. I certainly have I have a full original run of The Max and Friends of the Max by Sam Keith, because this is one of the first things I collected. It was super, super important to me. I have them all. But most of what I bought and most of what I still buy is not those, the like highly prized, fragile, like put it in plastic and never touch it. Like I want something I can read to tatters, and when I do, I can buy another one and it is okay.
Right. Now, there is a moment that I ask everybody about, but it's an important one in these conversations. Everyone who makes it onto this show has a moment where they went from reader to writer or from audience to creator. And so when was that moment for you in this? When did you start to say, I want to make my own?
I really came to that, I think, via fan fiction and fan culture. I wrote fan fiction before I knew fan fiction existed, like before the internet, when I realized this was a thing other people did. I kept notebooks of, I'm sure horrifically embarrassing now, but, alternate versions of stories that I liked and character backstories that I wished were more fleshed out. And, I was writing that for no one but myself. It was a very, very private and solitary and intimate kind of thing. And then when I discovered the internet and realized that this was something a lot of people did, and in fact, the idea that I could read someone else's alternate takes on things was completely revolutionary to me, and that I could provide that for somebody else was an extraordinary feeling. So it was really that relationship with experiencing like the profound joy of discovering a piece that someone else had written set in a universe I also loved, that was just there because we both loved that thing, and then also being able to give that experience back. That is incredibly addictive, and that feedback loop and that very unique relationship between creator and audience is super, super addictive and really, really lovely. And I think that it was really that connection that, convinced me this was the thing I for sure wanted to do with my life. I'd always kind of thought like I'm going to be a writer. Like I've always written things. I had been processing my life through the written word for a very long time at that point. But it was really that like, I have the internet at home now, and I'm spending a ridiculous amount of time online, and I'm developing this relationship with other writers and other readers, and this is what I want to do. This is the thing I want to keep happening to me.
I don't want to bounce off fan fiction too quickly because it's been a theme that's come up in a number of the conversations that we've had. It seems to have become a more and more common on-ramp for people starting to either build a practice of writing or as importantly, write with the knowledge that there's going to be someone on the other side reading, that you're writing plugging into a community. Were you both a writer and a consumer of fan fiction? Like, did that make up a significant part of your reading diet for a while?
Absolutely. Yeah. I would say that when I was, I would say it was pretty even for a while, certainly, like definitely when I was a teenager. And then kind of, I maybe drifted away for a while, but then in my mid-20s kind of came back to, in that way that I think a lot of us realized in our mid-20s and early 30s that like 16-year-old us actually really knew how to have a good time, and like there's something to these wizards and spaceships, and maybe I shouldn't be embarrassed about that.
That's right.
But
my life is becoming more stressful now, and I need some of those comforts.
I would like to play D&D again. Interesting.
Yeah.
Exactly. But certainly, like, for a long time, I would say it was pretty close to 50-50. And I think the experience of seeing, within the same universe, you could experience our, like, literally 500,000 word, like, slow burn friends to lovers, like, pairing fiction, or like a bunch of completely absurdist 100-word drabbles, and they both fit and functioned and were embraced, and like seeing the different forms and modes and the way that the people engaged with them, and the sort of like extremely supportive environment toward content generation. Like, it was, new updates were greeted with great joy, and that was a really cool thing to watch and participate in a lot. So yeah, I definitely say that, certainly for a while there it was probably half of what I was reading.
Well, and one of the things that I find so interesting about it is that for people getting started in writing, especially, it is completely counter to this idea of writing as the loneliest profession. That
Yeah.
you're doing it in the midst of both a supportive community, a feedback loop, an instant audience, in a way that just didn't exist before. And I wonder if that's making it easier for people to get through that first hard, like those first hard years of starting to put craft together.
I mean, that makes a lot of sense. It's also a great place to make mistakes in, writing wise. You know, you can no one is like looking for genius work when it's like, oh, I just want to read like another comfortable thing set in a universe I know I already love with characters I already like. It doesn't have to be perfect. It just has to like sit with me in a particular kind of way. And which isn't to say that there isn't some like utterly brilliant fan fiction on, I would argue, the level of any literature in the world. Like some of it's extraordinary, but it doesn't have to be. And that kind of the space where it doesn't have to be, I think is very, very important. And I think it lets writers, especially, people who are just figuring it out and finding their voice and figuring out what they'd like to write and figuring out how things work. You can make those mistakes pretty safely and, just kind of tell the story that you want to tell, and also get pretty constructive, gentle feedback, comparatively speaking, right? Like you get a lot of people who are super familiar with the characters and super familiar with the kinds of stories that are here, gently guiding you toward things, or people who have made the same mistakes giving you pointers, and it's all there kind of waiting for you. And that's really extraordinary.
When did poetry start to show up for you as something that both you wanted to read and you wanted to write?
I started both reading and writing poetry. I'd written some like very bad little kid poetry for sure. But when I was about 13 or 14, I started digging into it much more seriously, both as an outlet and also as somebody who was consuming poetry. I got very, very into experimental Canadian poetry pretty early. So like Christian Book and Karen Soley and, writers like that who are doing super weird things with language and the structural materiality of language. And, I started looking at the more concrete work of poets like B.P. Nicol, who I'd ultimately do my master's thesis on, who also wrote The Raccoons and Fraggle Rock. So like extremely cool.
I did not know that. Really?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, he was a writer for Fraggle Rock. Yeah. Wrote some really great episodes, in fact. It's all about joy at the end of the day. But yeah, that it's such a different creative mode from fiction. Like it feels like a completely different thing. Like it's a completely different art form. And honestly, like when I was a little bit older and, taking creative writing programs at the university level, I thought poetry at that point was the thing that was coming most naturally to me, that felt the most comfortable to do, it was the most intellectually stimulating, and that it could be extremely difficult, especially when you're getting into, again, more constraint-based poetry, which really, really intrigued me, and I was kind of forcing the pieces and the language that I was using into smaller and smaller boxes and tighter spaces, and putting more restrictions and on what I was creating. And I found that extremely creatively inspiring, and produced a lot of earlier work that I was very, very proud of. So it seemed at that point in my life that that was where I should focus my career's energy, that was the thing I should be doing.
So you have two collections of poetry, Thumbscrews and Doom, love poems for supervillains. And both of them deal either directly or indirectly with both the culture and the language of bondage and domination and S&M. Doom takes those themes and then layers superheroes and supervillains on top of them, but it it picks up for me on something that you were talking about earlier with the idea of poetry as constraint. And so I'm interested in how you put all of those together in poetry and what you were trying to explore there.
When I was about 17, I wrote a series of haiku that were bondage haiku. I chose the form specifically because it's incredibly spare and is entirely about constraint and restriction, but also about leap in logic or inspiration. It's kind of the spaces in haiku where things open up that are really, really extraordinary. For such a little poem, there's a huge amount of space inside. And that way, haiku are kind of like haunted houses. They're much bigger on the inside than the outside. And that pairing between spare little poem and big space inside really stuck with me. And I realized that, the pairing between BDSM as a topic and constraint-based or very formulaic poetry as a structure were profoundly wedded together in a way that warranted a lot more exploration. And the same kind of, starting with haiku, the same kind of internal space or internal leap that happens when the body is under constraint, when the poem is under constraint, is very similar to the way that there are internal leaps and revelations when the body is under constraint. Those things were very, very closely tied together for me. So Thumbscrews is a book-length exploration of those ideas. Like what is, when a body is restricted or a body is in pain, consensually speaking, what happens internally, what revelations are possible, what is the internal experience of those very external things. And how can I explore those ideas within poems that are in the form doing the exact same thing that I'm doing in the content, and trying to, wed those things together as closely as possible. And then when it came to Doom, I don't know, supervillains are hot. Like I've had a thing for bad guys my whole life. Like I'm sure this is not surprising to anybody listening to this podcast or who knows me at all, or characters who've always attracted me in real life and fictionally speaking. And there's lots of really great, weird, complicated bondage stuff in comics, man. Like there's a lot of people getting tied up in really, really suspicious ways, and there's a lot of like often unsettlingly erotic outfits, and not necessarily in the ways that they're intended to be, I don't think.
Everything's tight. Everything's tight all the time.
Everything is tight. There's a lot of obvious latex. Like these things are just connected, and that's great. But it is also something that I wanted to really call out and explore at the same time that I was exploring, kind of that my own feelings toward what villainy means and what being being an antagonist is, or being an adversary is. Like what are those ideas? How do they look like? And it also starts to poke at some of the more uncomfortable or unconsensual aspects or interpretations of bondage. For example, there's a chapter in Doom that's entirely about prisons, and is about that much more carceral relationship to bondage, and kind of starting to tinker with that, and like really profound discomfort and disgust I feel toward that. So there's a lot of that more complicated, I would say, relationship with ideas around bondage and constraint tied in there as well. And also, it's just like a fun, hot book about supervillains. Let's not forget that part.
Absolutely not. And a lot of these themes are going to come back again when we start to talk about Hench in a few minutes. But before I do, I wanted to talk a bit about kind of, poetry as a practice. Poetry may be the hardest road to walk from a career perspective, because it's never going to be a full-time gig. There's no one who just gets to put that on their business card and that's all there is. It's always going to be poetry and so I was wondering for you, was the hope or the goal that would be a central practice and then you would put other things around it? Or was it just one dimension of a kind of a multi-dimensional writing life?
I think probably closer to multi-dimensional writing life than this is going to be the core of my identity and I'm going to arrange a bunch of things around it. I definitely spent a long time trying to find ways that poetry could be more central and, sort of a constant presence in my creative life. Not that I've turned away from that at all. It's just gotten a lot more varied and complicated. And certainly when went into post-secondary, it looked for quite a while like I was going to just be able to seal myself away in the ivory tower and become an academic and not kind of deal with the earth anymore, which, for a while was very appealing to me. Probably because of the whole earlier wizards thing. It's like, you mean I can live in a tower and not have to talk to humans about anything that's not in a book? Perfect. So it looked at that point like I would be able to do academic work. I would be able to, teach, probably writing and write poetry. And that was about as complicated as I wanted to make it, or that seemed complicated enough for a while. But I wanted to do still more other and different things. So I didn't end up staying in the tower permanently at all.
And I think instead you've put together a very multifaceted career that crosses a bunch of different dimensions and a bunch of different media. Let's talk a bit about your work around gaming and what that's been like. How did you get into it? What have you been doing in it?
So like a lot of things that I do and love, I've played games since I was a kid. Since I got a Nintendo at home when I was a little kid, I have been playing and loving video games. I didn't actually consider that making them was going to be a thing I was able to do. That didn't necessarily seem like, whereas I definitely considered writing comics as a potential career when I was a kid or a teenager. I definitely looked at writing novels or what are career paths I could have. I could be a journalist, I could whatever. Making video games was not on that list because it didn't really enter I had no idea how it happened, how it could possibly occur. Then in 2013, I took a summer-long, it's called the Long Program. It's a series of workshops that a local organization called DMG runs. DMG is an organization that tries to create spaces for people of marginalized identities to make games and learn how to make games and do so safely and in a supportive environment. And this was sort of a long program for people who had never made a video game before. This is how you do it. I thought that was rad as hell, and signed up for it and made a extremely broken, non-functional little game about where you are a ghost haunting a house, trying to figure out what your relationship is with all of these still living people. It was called Restless, and it was hard and weird and a lot of fun. And I kind of never stopped making them after that point. I did a bunch of DMG game jams and other game jams, and I started making weird little text-based horror game one-shots, and I started, writing, taking on contract work to do dialogue or, voice line writing. And that slowly kind of snowballed into where I am now, which is often writing full game scripts, and doing story bibles and item descriptions for like 500 tiny objects that exist in a game, and trying to be funny the whole time, and writing branching narratives that are super super complicated and require maps. And I guess that's been like 8 years, which is a kind of banana phones thing to think about, because it definitely feels like 6 months or something. But yeah, that's sort of the very strange and circuitous route that got me there. I didn't think it was something that I was going to be able to do, and then I discovered absolutely it was.
Your entry into that space in some ways corresponds with the expansion of that industry out of being a purely programmer driven world. It's kind of from that early Nintendo time when it was really something that just was coming from engineers, to as we get into the 2000s, that's when artists are getting pulled in and writers are getting pulled in, and there's like essentially the humanities layer of the gaming world starts to get created. It's also the time when we're starting to have conversations about gender in gaming. We have, we go through that kind of crucible of Gamergate. We then start to build more of a dialogue around what does diversity and equity look like in the gaming space. And the two organizations that you're involved with, that DMG, Dames Making Games, and the Pixels, both work on that space. Can you tell me a little bit about what you're doing to try and push that forward?
I'm now on the board of DMG. It's one of those, like, they helped me at the very beginning, and now I want to do whatever I can to continue to expand that space and help it be a thing that exists in the world. I think space is a very important idea here, both when we talk about safety and safe space and what that means, and just literally breathing room to make a thing. And I think both Pixels, which I was much more involved in when I lived in Montreal briefly during another failed affair with academia, both of them do wonderful things to create those spaces, whether that is, like shorter, long programs, whether those are curated digital communities. When this was a thing that people could do in the world, both were ran extremely important in-person events, whether both socials and workshops and those sorts of game spaces. It's very hard to make things when you don't feel safe. It's very hard to make things when there is not room for you to make a thing. When you are, you're so much of your energy is going toward trying to keep your defenses up and fighting for whatever, bit of space that you can. So if there are organizations that can make those spaces and kind of uphold those boundaries for creators, and that might mean, just like giving them resources to work, making sure that they have access to the software and hardware that they need, making sure that there are people they can ask questions of who are not going to be like shitty or racist or talk down to them to the absolute best of their human ability, like whether that means like mediating difficult situations that come up in those spaces, whatever, or literally money, or literally platforms, running conferences where, new and marginalized creators have a space to speak from, right? Like creating all of those openings and protecting as many of those spaces as possible to allow other people to make stuff. The extraordinary things about like both Pixels and DMG is they're not game companies, right? Like they're not in the business of making games for consumption and just like hiring marginalized creators, for example, which by the way is incredibly important and crucial. This is just different work. It's what they're both concerned with, what they can do to make sure people have everything they have to make the games they want to make. And I think that's really extraordinary, and those are really, really extraordinary missions.
To address some of those issues from a content perspective rather than from kind of a people and personnel perspective, you created your own game, so you've been fridged. Can you tell me a little bit about the concept and then what the game is meant to illustrate?
So You've Been Fridged is a game jam game that I made with Izzy Colpitz Campbell and Kat Verhoeven, and I'm really glad you brought it up for another reason. So You've Been Fridged deals with the women in refrigerators problem that exists in comics, a term coined by Gail Simone, like back in something like 1999, which is the extremely unfortunate storytelling crutch of using women who are superpowered, either having them killed, having them assaulted, or having them be depowered in some way to advance the story of other characters, usually male characters, and sort of by their anguish or their death or their disenfranchisement is somehow a plot point, or a important lesson, or like emotional journey for somebody else.
This is the thing that kicks the hero into gear, that motivates them to like go and do the next thing.
Exactly. And the term comes directly from a moment in which someone's girlfriend was literally murdered and shoved in a refrigerator, extremely graphically, and then discovered by the hero. So You've Been Fridged takes place in a fridge or a chest freezer, and involves a superpowered woman trying to fight her way out and battling like ice crystals and frozen peas. And at the end, she encounters the narrative vortex, the big bad of this particular game, who has confined her to this frozen hellscape and associated role. The reason I'm really glad you brought that up, in addition to women in refrigerators being still a thing people are talking about, and a very lazy bit of writing that keeps happening, is it was at that game jam that I wrote the first words of Hench. Like I wrote the script for the game, and I was working with my co-creators, and there was a tiny lull where like I had found the sound files that somebody needed and another thing wasn't ready, and I had a little pocket of time at this jam, and I wrote the first couple scenes of Hench.
The segue is perfect, because the issues that you're exploring in that game and the issues that we start to talk about in Hench overlap nicely in that idea that unless you're the marquee character, if you're the sidekick, the friend, the partner, especially if you're a woman, your odds are not good in most superhero literature.
No, definitely not.
Dismally bad. And so to kind of continue that on and talk about your latest book, Hench, introduce us to Anna. Tell us a bit about her life.
Anna is, at the beginning of the book, is a administrator and data analyst who has been working for supervillains for a couple of years. She's a freelancer, like a lot of folks, and is just trying to find a gig that might be semi-permanent and might let her go to the dentist, like a lot of us constantly are. She works these, terrible jobs for very bad people because they are the jobs that are available to her. I have worked for organizations that I don't super love the mission statement of, like I lived in Calgary and very briefly did admin for an oil company because I really needed the money and my marriage was falling apart, and it was very easy and definitely made the world a lot worse in doing so. And that, I've had a lot of those experiences, and they had a pretty big impact on me. So Anna is someone who is initially just trying to get by and is very, sometimes quite uncomfortably, doing tasks that it kind of doesn't matter who you do them for. You know, whether you're answering the phones at, you know, an insurance company or an arms dealer or a supervillain is not really a very different experience. So she's someone who's less about engaging with, you know, being a hench person and more dealing with survival in an extremely unpleasant and hostile environment, very similar to our own. And it is after she experiences very directly exactly how destructive heroics can be and how deeply injurious and harmful those activities can be, that she kind of has to grapple much more immediately and intimately and violently with the cost of heroics and her place in that world and those relationships and you know, what she wants to do about that moving forward.
I mean, let's be clear. It is a very funny book. It is a, you know, there are, like, you know, for all that we're talking about very deep themes of good and evil, it's also a really funny book. One of the things I love about it is that it's a novel about workplaces. You know, is there good coffee? You know, can you get your, you know, the excitement of like getting your project approved, and you know how we all might be willing to overthrow government if it meant that you could get good extended health benefits. Like, yeah,
absolutely.
All of the things that kind of make us decide, like, is this a place that I want to come back to every day?
One of my favorite jobs that I have ever had is I worked as a cheesemonger in a fine cheese market for a while. It was great. I got to eat a lot of cheese and drink a lot of wine while I was at work, and my coworkers were also, you know, both hilarious and in similarly terrible places in their life, and it was really, really great, and the pay was awful. And, you know, I got stress eczema all over my hands from the hours that I worked and having to, you know, wash my hands 75,000 times a day. And it was not really good for me. But once a week during very busy periods, the owner would have a massage therapist come in, and everybody got like a half-hour massage. And because of that, I like was more loyal to that job and that organization than I think I have been to any earthly organization in my entire life. It's those tiny benefits are so important. And again, like that had a pretty profound impact on me, you know, like would I be a hench person if I for sure got like really good physio and extended dental? I might. I know this about myself now.
Especially if maybe you yourself aren't doing the bad thing. Maybe you're acting purely in a supporting role.
Like I'm filling out a spreadsheet.
Yeah,
that's fine. I can definitely pretend a terrible thing isn't happening for quite some time.
Well, and throughout this book, you have heroes doing bad things. You have villains being good bosses. You have hench people who are, you know, also decent coworkers or bad coworkers. Is part of this all, you know, an exercise in just asking us to look past labels to get to the fundamentals of people's actions? Like, what are you actually doing, and what does that say about you?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's part of it. You know, that the a huge problem in the universe of the book, as well as, you know, our own earthly one, is the power of labels. So if you're a hero, you're a good person, and if you're a villain, you're a bad person, and kind of bifurcating the entire world that way is not only inaccurate, but extremely dangerous, because it lets anybody who's been labeled a hero, you know, hide behind that veneer of whether it's respectability or, you know, like, whatever the curtain is. Like a lot of very, very bad things can happen behind it. And a lot of the potential goodness on the other side is dismissed or devalued or, deprecated in some way, both of which are very damaging and dangerous in their own particular ways. So definitely something I am doing is asking readers to look past those labels or that, kind of binary value system into something a lot more gray and complicated. But it's also, I think, asking readers to look very carefully at the work those kinds of labels are doing. Like, what is the value of hiding behind it? What work are those labels doing in the worlds in which they exist? What does calling somebody a hero potentially obscure? What does calling somebody a villain potentially dismiss? And like looking at the work that is doing, as well as trying to deconstruct it.
We are in a time of polarization. We're at a time where ideological walls are especially high. Is there a proxy for that in this? Like, because you're either a villain or you're a hero, and there is nothing in between.
Absolutely. Like, I think it's it's. I don't think my metaphors are very light. I'm not being super subtle. I said this in a couple of interviews, and I stand by it, that comics have a lot in common with the Fairy Queen. Edmund Spencer's The Fairy Queen, and that the characters tend to be like physical manifestations of ideas much more than they are people. You have much in The Fairy Queen, like a person represents love. Comics, you have people who represent justice and people who represent vengeance or whatever, they're much more bound to those ideas than they are their own humanity. And I'm very interested in putting the humanity back into those characters and those situations and those roles and those perceptions. And I'm directly challenging people to look at who we are comfortable labeling heroes and what that is doing to obscure potential damage and wrongdoing. And, when alleged heroes are doing much more harm than good in the communities that they're ostensibly there to protect, what is happening there, and what are the potential dangers of those kinds of classifications. Like, they're not light or gentle metaphors. Like, they're pretty direct parallels. There's Anna directly says she's a penal abolitionist, and I'm very much we are definitely not the same person, but on those particular issues we're very closely aligned.
You wrote an excellent piece for The Walrus where you describe a job that you had doing search engine optimization for an online porn company. And
yes,
did that give you some of the kind of the foundational ideas or the tone for this book that is kind of partly how do I feel about this, this particular job on one hand, and partly I'm being driven crazy by that person who keeps microwaving fish for lunch every day?
Absolutely, yes. 100% yes. It was a super weird job that was both like a lot of fun and really uncomfortable, and not for the reasons that that you might think. The content was 100% never a problem. The people I worked with often were, but also were often great. So that experience definitely stuck with me and resonated with me. And there are certainly interactions that I had with, my coworkers and my bosses that are not identical in the book, but certainly reflect real life experiences that I've had.
And you don't have to answer this, but is it possible that there is a passing resemblance between your boss's boss in the porn company and Hench's first villain employer, Electric Eel?
100% yes. I'm absolutely comfortable saying
yes.
that. Yeah, the resemblance is not identical for sure. Honestly, my real life boss was much less harmless and much more creepy, but that he's terrible, but is kind of weirdly lovable in his terribleness, in a way that my human Earth boss was never quite able to achieve. But there's definitely at least glancing resemblance to that character and situation.
And as an important karmic lesson for all of us who might, find ourselves in managerial positions, that, should you not be good at your job, you could find yourself immortalized as a like B or C grade, not especially successful supervillain. Like that could be in the cards for you, and conduct yourself accordingly.
Conduct yourself accordingly. In A Knight's Tale, which I maintain is an excellent movie, Paul Bettany in the role of Chaucer says to a couple of characters who sort of tormented and humiliated him throughout the entire book, he notes that he had to be naked for a day. He will make them naked in prose for eternity. And I love that very much. It's a wonderful moment that I hold close to the burnt out little cinder of my heart. Which isn't to say that like most of the work, and even most of E, is not directed toward a particular person. It's like, oh, there's definitely a glancing resemblance to this unfortunate person and uncomfortable situation that I was in that, like, there's also I had a coworker who I did not get along with, who microwaved a lot of fish. She also brought me someone else's cake on the last day of my job there, and you know what, like, I didn't immortalize that in fiction yet necessarily. There are definitely lots of real world situations that never make them in, but I definitely feel a little bit, not a little bit, quite a lot of it, that, if folks don't want to be thought badly about, they should behave better. And it is not my fault.
It seems like a simple rule, and yet
it really does. And it is not my fault if in potentially reflecting any of that reality in fiction or otherwise, or writing that piece for the Walrus, which is about my actual life and a piece of nonfiction. If you don't want such things immortalized in print or online in one way or the other, perhaps conduct yourself accordingly. That is all.
Seems fair. This was your first novel. Were there other books that you looked to, other books that you had on the shelf as you were starting to write this one?
It's, in a lot of ways, Hench is a sort of gradual accretion of, like a lifetime of reading comics and collecting, for sure. Soon I Will Be Invincible had a really, really deep impact on me when I first read it. It was the first book I'd read from the perspective of a supervillain, really, really deeply. That definitely had an impact on me. Paradise Lost is really important and to me, and is kind of the relationship between Satan, the adversary to the world, and Satan's character in Paradise Lost really deeply informs the way that I write villains. I have Dore's engraving of Lucifer falling as a half sleeve, so perhaps this shouldn't be surprising that was important to me. I think Sandman was also really important as well. Those comics have a lot of characters moving through roles a lot. Someone who is a victim or a villain in one context becomes, a protagonist in another, and, characters who are deeply disenfranchised in one instance become incredibly powerful in other places. And that kind of fluidity of role was also really, really important to me. A little like later on, books like Vicious by V. Schwab, really, really important. Books like The Night Circus and a bunch of stuff by Catherine Valente, both of which feel very Erin Morgenstern and Valente's work both feel very messed up fairy tale to me, which is also a thing that is very, very important. So yeah, a lot. I'm definitely missing fully 3/4 of my inspirations probably in saying this. I know I'm always leaving people out, but
as I got to the end of Hench, I couldn't help feeling that this was a book that has a sequel locked and loaded and ready to go. Is that a possibility? Is that something you've been thinking about?
It's definitely something I've been thinking about. It's also something that I'm not secretly working on. There's no guarantees, there's okay. Definitely I have no I am working on that. I have no idea what the future holds. There nothing is certain or set in stone, but I love these characters. I have a super fun time writing in this universe. I think that as much as Hench is, I really wanted to make it a standalone unit.
And it absolutely is.
Yeah, there's a complete story arc in there, and it works that way. I would love to spend more time there, and I do think there's a lot more to explore.
500,000 words of slow burn arc. That's what we're...
I want the fan fiction. Get on this.
There needs to be Hench fan fiction hanging off the side of this is what we're looking for. Then the dream has come true.
That's literally my high bar of have I succeeded? Does fan fiction exist? Yes, done. I've done it.
Yeah, hang it up.
Goals achieved.
Open a B&B. You're finished.
I'm done. I'm gonna retire.
Natalie, thank you so much for joining us.
Oh, thank you so much for having me. This has been lovely.
I've been speaking with Natalie Zina Walschots. Her latest book is the novel Hench. It and the other books we have talked about here, along with previous episodes of the show, can be found at kobo.com/conversation, or check the show notes. Be sure to catch every conversation by subscribing wherever you listen, and leave us a rating, or even a rating and a review, because it helps other readers find us. Kobo in Conversation is produced by Nathan Maharaj and hosted by me, Michael Tamblyn. Thank you for listening.